Okay, so thank you. So our second speaker today is Leslie, and Leslie, I will let you introduce yourself and what you're going to do, because this is my new MO now. I let people take it away because I always say something wrong.
Okay, so from Bibles to burlesque. I mean, you can't get much different than that in a day. So welcome, thank you for coming to the wild world of burlesque. This was a journey that started completely by happenstance for me in 2006 when I don't want to say hooked up. I hooked up with some women. I found some of these burlesque women and they told me their stories. And it was amazing to me, and I thought, you know, I didn't know anything about burlesque, and so really quick, what is burlesque? I have a prize, so what is mine? Does anybody know? Anybody else?
It was sort of family-based entertainment. There's more to burlesque than we think of.
Right, but what does the word burlesque mean? People frantically Googling? I have a prize. Guess, what is burlesque? What is to burlesque something?
Display.
Yes, you get the prize. Wear them well. Pasties. Oh, nice. The answer, what burlesque is, it's to spoof, it's imitation, it's mockery, it's humor. And that's what burlesque is, and it's very obviously misunderstood. We think it's stripping, we think it's naughty, we think it's all these things, but it started out as humor. It was all humor-based. Now, when it first came to America in the 1860s, it came as a play, and it was started in England as they would spoof the popular plays of the day. If Hamlet was popular, somebody would do a spoof on it. You know, it could be a little naughty, but that really wasn't the reference. So it came to America in the 1860s with a play called The Black Crook. And it was a bunch of different variety type acts. It was 5.5 hours long. It sold out. It ran for months and made gobs of money. Part of it was the first time women were shown the ballerinas with their legs, flesh-colored legs, which was very shocking. So that's how it started. So there was always a little bit of an element of girls in it. But what was a burlesque show? Now, in its heyday, which was really the 20s and the 40s, what we think of as the golden age of burlesque, it was I love this quote from one of my men in the film, it was a variety show with a little more spice. And it was a huge hour-and-a-half, 2-hour show, 20 chorus girls, 2 to 4 comedians. There was variety acts, there was acrobats, there was hand blowers. Hand blowers, is that right? Hand blowers, that sounded nasty. Hand blowers, yeah, no, glass blowers. I don't know what I'm saying now. Okay, but really strange acts. I know everybody's shocked now. There could be animal acts. And the strippers were a very small part of the act. It was about the comedians. It was about the humor. And it started and became so popular in New York because New York had a big immigrant population. They could not afford to go to a Broadway show. They couldn't even understand the language. But they could go to a burlesque show and watch pretty girls, but they understood the humor. If there's 2 comedians here and a pretty girl walks by and the comedian's tie rises, they could understand it. They could participate in that. And it costs nothing. And burlesque always thrives in tough economic times, during the Depression. You couldn't afford to go to a Broadway show. People couldn't afford to produce it. So a lot of those actors also worked in a burlesque show, whether they would admit it or not. But people could go to a show, and they can afford it, and they can laugh. For a dime, they can sit there all day if they wanted to and be entertained. It was a huge, huge entertaining show. So who, yes?
What's the difference between that and vaudeville?
The girls. The stripping. There was no stripping in burlesque, which is why burlesque took over from vaudeville. And the times are changing. It, you know, our humor became more sophisticated, and burlesque always tries to change throughout time to keep up with whatever's going on. And so who was in a burlesque show? Joe E. Lewis was a velvet-throated singer working in Chicago in a club run by Capone's lieutenant. Hugely popular. He, his contract ran out. He got another offer from a competing club. Said, I'm going to take it, they're paying me more money. He gets a knock one night on his hotel door. Two guys show up, cut his face, slit his throat, cut out part of his tongue. It took him 2 years to learn how to talk. He became a huge comedian in burlesque. So well respected that when he died, Sinatra was at his funeral. Sinatra played him in the movie about him. It's called The Joker is Wild. Rags Raglan, big, handsome bar fighter, really. Comedian, was in burlesque. Always getting drunk. He actually died of alcohol-related diseases. He would go, there was usually a bar next to a burlesque club. In between acts, when he's not working, he would go there and have a couple drinks, get in fights, come back on stage like nothing happened. He was so well respected. Again, Sinatra sang at his funeral. I mean, these were really respected people. Alan Alda's father was a big singer and straight man in burlesque. And he was known as, and Alan taught me this, I had no idea, as the tit singer, which meant, and he says, oh, it's an official title. I don't know if you had to go out and get a degree for it, but it was an official title. He would sing while the chorus girls danced around behind him. They had their tops on, but you know, not very much. Her prize of pasties. So, for all intents and purposes, you know, they could be naked, but they really weren't. Tiny Klein was an immigrant who came here to America. And she worked in the circus and the carnival, which had burlesque acts. They were really hugely popular. And in between, when it was the off season, she would do acrobatic acts. She hung she put this strap in her mouth and hung and twirled down. She went across from building to building. Well, Walt Disney saw her in a show. And he said, I have an idea. How about every night, and she did this, she agreed to this, you climb up Sleeping Beauty's castle, get on a wire, and fly across my new theme park. She was the very first Tinkerbell who was in burlesque. She was 70 years old when she did that. So there's a whole, I mean, and you see pictures of her, and she's got muscles. So maybe who you think of was in burlesque was not. It was all kinds of people, and strippers is what made it different than vaudeville. Strippers eventually is what they used to draw more people in. So a lot of the acts over time would go by the wayside, but it was still comedy, comedians, and strippers and the strip acts. And it could be a very long life for the strippers. A lot of them stripped into their 40s. Lili St stripped into her 50s. Sherry Britton stripped into her 60s. Sally Rand stripped into her 70s. And Tempest Storm stripped into her 80s. And the only reason that she stopped is because she fell off the stage and broke her leg. Otherwise, I guarantee you she would still be doing it. Yeah. So, you know, this was a career that they held dear to them, and they respected, and they tried to bring a lot of artistry to their acts. They weren't prostitutes. Another great quote, when the strippers were asked if they were prostitutes, they said, "We don't have time to be prostitutes, we're in rehearsal." It was a busy, busy career. You could work 6 shows a day, 6 days a week, week after week. Many of them said they never took a day off. They didn't want to take a day off. There was no time. You do a show for a week, you hop on a train, you're in another city the next week, over and over and over. And some of them made fabulous, fabulous sums of money. Some did okay and just made a great living in a time when there wasn't very many other choices, especially for women. A lot of the girls came from really hard backgrounds, a lot of poverty, and they were escaping their situations and not very well educated, so there wasn't that many options for them. They could be a secretary if they could type, maybe. Beverly Anderson, I met her, she was a New York talent agency. She was the first one in New York, first female one. Beautiful, tall, red-headed woman. She was born with rheumatoid arthritis, so her hands were kind of like this. She said, "I was the only stripper who never took off my gloves." She said, I couldn't be a waitress or I couldn't be a typist, as most struggling actresses are, but I could be a stripper. She was working, so she never took her gloves off. She was working in Kentucky during the Kentucky Derby in a club. It was really hot. The tables were really close to the stage. She's backstage, she had a jungle act. She's putting on all her costume. And she hears her overture, "Oh my God, I have to go." So she runs out, she doesn't get her gloves on. She does the show, blah, 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 went great. Afterwards, a man in the audience came up to the owner and said, "How dare you hire a crippled stripper?" She was fired that night. Makes me sad, and just sent home without her pay. Don Rickles, who was the comedian on the act, paid her way. It was a really tight society of people. They loved each other, they honored each other. Oh, she died recently, so. She was so ashamed, one of the few out of the many, many that I interviewed, about what she had done. Not that she'd done anything, that she was in burlesque. She said she was getting married to this man who was a press agent for Broadway shows. And he went to the paper and he said to his friend, "I want you to do a story on my soon-to-be wife next week. She was a Latin Quarter showgirl," which she was, "and her name's blah, blah, blah." And the reporter said, "Oh, I know her. She used to be a stripper." Her husband was like, "What?" I have no idea. She didn't tell her sons until a year before I interviewed her, and they were 48 and 50. Wow. But by the end of the interview, about an hour, she said, "You know, it was a hell of a life, and I'm glad I did it." And I think that's how most of them, Sherry Britton claims to be the only one that ever hated it, loudly hated it. And yet she liked stripping, because when stripping in the 30s, when it started moving out of theaters and went into nightclubs, it was the same thing. It was burlesque in nightclubs, and she did strips there, and she loved it. It was great. Tempest, I didn't introduce you to play Starr, who's probably, she's probably this tall, so she's not quite that short. I don't know if you ever saw the movie with Paul Newman plays, the big affair with Governor Earl Long and JFK. And JFK is a lot in my book because he went out with a lot of the burlesque girls. She came from a really poor background, and I kept hearing this story and I thought, you guys are just making this up, or you're reading each other's biographies and telling me the same story. Her, Tempest Storm, and a few others were both all gang raped as teenagers. And I only say that because this is the kind of life, so most of them ran away. Got married, Tempest got married for like a day or something to get away. They were really escaping really, really hard backgrounds and really did make something of their lives. Blaze did well, she invested her money. She said, "I had a Jewish manager and he said, you save for someday when you're when those looks are gone and you're not getting no goodies from any men anymore, so I saved, I bought stock. You know, she's really smart. A lot of them did not do as well. They didn't think the good days were ever going to end. And it also was a very, it could be in a very expensive game to be in. Dixie Evans, who recently died too, Marilyn Monroe of Burlesque, because she looked just like her, said, you know, you didn't go into that agent's office unless you had a mink coat. You didn't show up without driving a Cadillac. It was all, you know, they were as beautiful as any movie stars, and they had to dress the part, and they had to look as popular as they wanted to be or were. So they put a lot of money back into their acts. And the thing that one of the most surprising things, I had no idea is, and the reason they loved it so much, they pretty much self-produced their act. They could be in a show, a lineup of an hour and a half, 2 hour show with many acts, but they are producing their portion. They go in and say, this is the music I'm using, these are the costumes I'm doing, this is the act I'm doing. So that also means, you know, they spent thousands of dollars on their costumes, or, you know, like Blaze, this is, you can't see it so well in here, this is all little mirrors that she hand sewed, which I now own. She also had this great pink gown with crystals on it. She said, it took me, and she has this great voice, she thinks she's still 19, it took me 6 months to sew that thing. She goes, but I had no idea when I put it on, it was so heavy, I couldn't wait to get out of that. And it is so heavy. I own that also. And she was supposedly supposed to go on, I think it was the Johnny Carson show. And she had 6 months, and she knew about it, and she was supposed to go on opposite Zsa Zsa Gabor. She said, I'm gonna out-bling her, so that's why she put all these crystals on her that she could never, like, wear because it was so heavy. And the reason I have this is because my daughter's name is Zsa Zsa, so she goes, you must have this gown. So it was like such a small world. And like I said, burlesque had many acts. Blaze worked with a lot of animals. You know, she'd get a panther, and she'd get a jaguar, and she'd get a leopard, and they all kept dying by happenstance, you know. You know, swallowed this toy and died. She said one day she was in her hotel room, which I can't even imagine, and she left the panther there to go out shopping. She came back, the firemen were there, everybody's running up and down. The panther, or the black leopard, or whatever it was, had managed to go into the shower and turn the water on, and it was flooding everything, and they weren't going to go in there. So she went in there, and she said it jumped on her back, and she thought it was going for her jugular. So she goes, that's when I decided this might be a little dangerous, I'm not going to do animal acts anymore. Like, yeah, you think? Rudy and Renaud were hand balancers. They did very like Cirque du Soleil acts. They worked 25 years in burlesque, being hand balancers. You think, you know, how was that possible? They had such a tight, close relationship. Their story is really sweet. And I always like, and we'll open it up for questions and answers. I could talk forever, but I never know like where people want to go with their things. Is to put stripping in the context of its time. The bikini wasn't invented until 1946. There was not Playboy magazine until 1953. There was nowhere to go see flesh, not even real exposed, but I mean, you did not see women walking around on the streets, their arms and their legs. And I always like to take the 40s. Because that's my drugs. So you would have more. You'd have a hat, you'd have the gloves, you have this, and you didn't see anything like that. But you go to a burlesque house, and this is what you would see. And it was shocking. And now remember, this is humor burlesque. So this is why I have it like this. So there you go. Are there any questions?
sort of how far did it get into this the 50s and the 60s? So really, but before World War II, it's very much.
Oh yeah, and every time the soldiers came home, of course, they would pack the burlesque houses. There's varying opinions. In my opinion, burlesque, as we know it, as a big variety show that had the comedians and other acts, died out in the 50s. Some people will say it was into the 70s, but it really wasn't. It became a strip act. And when television came along, that did a lot to hurt burlesque. So they tried to say, oh, we're going to air condition the theaters. And you would see on the marquee, the girls would be so mad that they would have air conditioning bigger than their names. But they were trying to compete. And then as our ways became more sophisticated, as there was Playboy magazine, as you can go to the beach and see a girl in a bikini, burlesque became moot. So they would add more girls. So it really became a different kind of stripping. It became of what we think of as stripping, not necessarily an art, as Kitty West, Evangeline, the oyster girl. They all kind of sound southern. They talk like this. She would come out of a big oyster shell on Bourbon Street in the 40s and 50s. She said the girls today, they just come out naked and stay naked and go off naked. I mean, these girls came on in this era with big, beautiful gowns. I mean, unbelievable. You would think that wasn't a stripper. So it's very different. Then it changed to what stripping is today, which is why there's the stigma. It's why when I would tell people I was doing this movie on burlesque, they're like, "Oh, prostitutes," and it's like, no, not at all.
How did burlesque get from burlesque to the nightclub? Because you sort of touched on that. So if you start with, if you look at Bourbon Street as maybe an example of how this trended in the country.
Yeah. Well, really in New York, and I believe it was in 37. I get my years mixed up. 36, 37. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia closed burlesque. We closed 14 burlesque houses in one night.
Shame on you.
I know. Put a lot of people out of work. 6 months later, it was all back, but they couldn't use the word burlesque. They couldn't use the word Minsky, who were the big producers at the time. They could call it a review or a Follies, but he didn't touch the nightclubs, which were going on at the same time. So it's still, in the 40s, you could still go to burlesque theaters. They were still in some of the big, beautiful vaudeville houses. But that, it really became expensive to produce a show. The orchestras, they had huge orchestras, and it gradually would go down to maybe 3 musicians. They would cut the chorus girls. It was a cost thing. And, it was cheaper and more effective to do it in a nightclub also. And people were, I think, going to that kind of entertainment more than maybe the theater.
How long did they last here, like on Main Street or Broadway? Like, when did that kind of appear out? Same time? Like,
well, the Follies was, I believe, until the 70s, and they demolished it.
74, Follies was 74.
Yeah, so, there's still stuff going on. I don't know, once it gets into the 60s, it's really a different kind of show.
Well, the juxtaposition with I guess even the sexual revolution was switching. Because I remember my mom telling me she would go with my dad, and they weren't exactly, swingers or anything like that, to go to burlesque shows. When they were in San Francisco, they would do that. And then, eventually you're having like full nude.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the most obvious place. It's still in the same area. But,
yeah, Carol Doder, that was like,
right,
she thought it was burlesque, she really wasn't.
And they probably weren't, going to go to that kind of thing. But, yeah, I can see where it would.
And also early on, it really was considered a family show. And in a lot of the nightclubs, Sherry Britton worked at Leon and Eddie's on 52nd Street, which was all the jazz clubs and became all the strip clubs. So went from Swingin' Street to Striptease Street. And she remembers, kids in the audience.
And did laws change too? Because I remember walking on, I saw The Graduate, as I'm sure everyone did, I was 10 or 11, like, wow, look at that. And maybe I was 13 or 14 walking down Bourbon Street, this little sled, the woman had cases on. I don't think they have any cases on Bourbon Street. This is, 30 years ago. Like,
kind of like that way today. I was there 2 weeks ago for a burlesque festival. I'm like, what?
So do you think like laws changing, like they allowed people to be like fully nude in San Francisco or?
Yeah, I don't know about the laws for that. At the time, it depended on the theater, it could depend on the city, and it could depend on the era. There was, each theater had its own laws, or each city did. Like you could not take off clothes on stage. Some of the strippers had to go off stage to remove clothing and then come back on with a little less for their whole entire act. You know, some of them, you know, the G-strings, so this would have been, they would have worn a panty over this with a big panel up the back. You know, you couldn't show a certain amount of things. Some of them, they would have the pasties, but you still had to have a net bra over it. Yeah. So some of them really didn't strip down much depending on where they were. You had a question?
Yeah, I just wondered, in Los Angeles specifically, where was the big scene? What theaters were they?
It was on Main Street. There was the Follies, there was the Burbank, there was the Mayan down here someplace. I don't know if it's still here. There was the Aztec. Yeah. There was also, it was in clubs, there was Ciro's. Which Lili St, who's my next book, I hope to finish it like in a couple weeks, did her act out of a bathtub. There was Larry Potter's Supper Club. There was a lot on Hollywood and Vine that were nightclubs, jazz clubs that they would have a stripper.
Quarantine Gardens?
Yes, absolutely. Although there were burlesque acts, that's not considered a burlesque house. It was considered, you know, I don't know, vaudeville acts, you know, just like Earl Carroll's, but that had the same burlesque strippers and comedians.
Were there any burlesque performers that were like LA specific?
Betty Rowland, she said she you know, she's still alive, 90 something. She tells me she's 100, but it's like, Betty, you're really not. So cute. She said she got big hair. And she's another, this is why I started out doing this documentary, because, like I said, a lot of these people had never told their stories, and these stories were so fascinating. And then I ended up with over 100 hours worth of footage. And the film came out, it did great, it's on Showtime. But I had all these stories, and Betty was one of them. Her story, she had 2 other sisters that were in burlesque, and they were all big at the time. Her one sister marries a baron, like the richest guy who owns the subways in Paris. There's a little mystery as to the death of her, which was happening as I was filming Betty. And her story was just so, you couldn't get it on tape clear. So partly stories like that I put in the book. And people, the movie's very first-hand account of their time in it, but there were people that were very important to burlesque that I put in the book that I didn't do the research. Nobody told me about them.
And Betty danced at the Follies.
A lot, and the Burbank. She was down in San Diego, the Hollywood, and I mean she did go back east too, but she was one of the big LA ones.
So when the women quit stripping if they didn't marry a baron or someone other fabulous? I mean, I like Lili St had that lingerie store for years on Santa Monica. She was kind of capitalizing on her fame. Did they tend to do things like that, or did they just kind of morph it to normal life?
They did. Some absolutely went back to a normal life and their normal names. When I was filming this, I filmed a reunion of a bunch of them, which is how I started. You know, I thought it would be just this long week and I'd get all their stories. It took me 2 years after that to get more people. Some of them still wanted to strip. They're like, oh, can you give me tape of that because I want to go get a job in their 70s. Luckily, you know, in that era, it really could be a long career. They could strip as long as they wanted to, and a lot of them did. I would say they didn't marry and then drop out of it. Sometimes they got married, they would pop back into it if they needed money. But they went on to normal, to every kind of thing, factory workers to Joan Arlene, God bless her, hilarious. She just recently died, they all died since I've done the film. She had an act with 2 Russian wolfhounds that just laid there on a rug. You know, they all had one of their little gimmick things. So they laid there on a rug, and she finally got rid of them after they won their 6-month-old baby. Oh my God, what was my point? What were you asking?
Like, what would they go?
Oh, okay, so what she became an elder in the church. You know, they all just went on to various careers. And she goes, and I did a number. The lady is a tramp in church. I thought it was great. They're very funny people. A lot of funny strips, like mine. Anybody else?
I'm wondering, and this might be a bit, it's really the edge of what you're talking about. You were just in New York, though. I used to love Times Square because it really, the sex industry in Times Square evolved out of the vaudeville houses.
Right.
Is there any, at what point did really the sex industry as it existed up until its demise in the last 5 years transform from the vaudeville houses, and they turn these wonderful 19th century theaters into these
Peep shows.
Yeah.
Peep shows. And at what point can we start to look to that? Because I think
some of that was in the 50s, because some of these women remember, very few, but there was one woman who worked New Orleans a lot, burlesque, and she remembers having to dance. They each had to dance for like 20 minutes, which is a long time, as a guy in a peep show type thing. They'd be the center dancer. I'm not sure how. I have a feeling it was pretty raw, what she was wearing. Most of them didn't. Blaze remembers, and this was probably later, this was probably 70s, I want to say, still doing her act, but they were playing hardcore porn on the wall behind her. So they really, you know, that's where really people started thinking, oh, burlesque was that. It's just transgressed in that. But not many of them did a lot of the peep show stuff. It's the people that came in the 50s and the strippers that came in the 60s and the 70s, that was more the kind of life. Even though it was still called burlesque.
Thank you.
How did you become interested in this project?
Well, basically because I didn't know what burlesque was. I was doing kind of a cabaret show, and I just started, you know, I thought, oh, Gypsy Rose Lee's burlesque, and what is it? And then, like I said, I started researching, and I started talking to some of these women, and it kind of snowballed, and I just met so many amazing people. So I wanted to document it because nobody had, and people really thought so terribly, and still do, of the whole industry, but the women in particular. And it was bigger than strippers. I interviewed one woman named Mimi Reed, who was 97. Oh my God, she was sharp as a tack. She could still stick her leg up over her head. And I have a picture of it. It might even be in the book. But it took me 6 months very few wouldn't talk to me, especially once I knew somebody that they knew, but she was just going through a loss. Her partner of 60 years had just died. So it took me 6 months. I sent her pictures of my kids, and can I come over and da-da-da. So I finally did, and I said, were you a stripper? She said, no, I should have been. I would have made a lot of money. She was a specialty dancer. She just danced with a big ball, and she did operatic dances and comedy bits. And to me, that was fascinating. I had no idea that there were those kind of acts in burlesque. And she was another one. She loved it and did it for years. When she got out, she worked in a real estate office. You know, as a secretary, I think. But it was this bigger world that's lost. These people's stories are lost. If I'd started 10 years earlier, I would have had even much more of this history. I mean, this burlesque was the premier form of entertainment in America. Johnny Carson did skits from it on his show. He loved the burlesque houses and would go to them. Saturday Night Live. Carol Burnett, when she comes out Gone with the Wind with the poles, that's burlesque. It's, you know, making fun of Gone with the Wind. And I just think it's a really important part of our entertainment culture in America that we shouldn't be ashamed of anymore. We should, you know, these people should get their day in the sun too, and I really wanted to honor them. So That's why I've spent the past 6 years of my life in burlesque. I can't get out.
Do you think there's any chance for a resurgence?
There's a huge, huge resurgence now. It started in the 90s. When my film came out in 2010, it debuted in Dublin, of all places, and they had a huge burlesque, which isn't their culture. There's this huge neo-burlesque resurgence everywhere. There's festivals everywhere, there's shows everywhere. It's huge, huge, huge. It's new, it's mostly strippers, but a lot of them are comedic. And a lot of them are just like the girls before. They spend all their time sewing these amazing, elaborate gowns and really bring an artistry to their act. And they also don't go down. They go down as much as they did.
Can you get a date on that neo-resurgence? I was in Paris by the late 90s.
It's the late 90s.
Yeah, but I mean, was there a specific place that it happened, or was it just kind of...
I don't know.
Were they all on the internet?
I just don't, I'm still back in the 40s and 50s, so I don't,
I don't know, it's
do know that.
interesting.
Yeah.
It was after like here in LA, like after the swing revival and some other things.
I mean, I just think these young girls found these women and they really honor them and, try and some recreate their acts. But it's huge and getting bigger by the day.
Where should people go if they just either in town they want to see a good neo? I don't mean for you to pick favorites, but just
right.
Just
I'm going to more now because they make me judge stuff. And it's great. I sell my book. You just have to Google Chicago burlesque, and there's some that come up. Or there's a couple in Hollywood here. I haven't seen the ones here, so I don't know. But generally, whatever city it is, there's a burlesque show going on at least once a week. Festivals all over the world.
I think there's one at East Side Love, Heights on Saturday nights.
There used to be one down here at a place I can't remember the name.
Oh, yes.
Little Pedro.
Yeah, 6th and Mateo, which was a former settlement house.
It all comes around.
Bell White's Children's Home.
Yeah, 6th and Mateo.
That's a good name for a strip club.
There you go. Anybody else? Should I put my clothes back on?
I bet you haven't had that yet, down here, right?
You're here, your book, you have your book, you have your DVD. Good, so people can come up and get a copy if they want. And thank you again, everyone thank Leslie.
Faces when I get like the first button, they're like, no, she's not. And that's, the very first time I did it at Barnes & Noble. Whatever, they'd never seen it either. So I have all my little sheets like this, and it's packed, and it's really crowded. And I got the microphone, I was like, no, I don't need this microphone. Later, my husband said, she's not. She's going to take off her clothes. He knew. He was like, yes, of course, that's me married.
God bless you. God bless you. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming. My Broadway walking tour is going to start in like 20 minutes or half, I don't know, something like that. 20. Stephen, you're here. Stephen, raise your hand. Stephen is going to help me give my walking tour of the history of burlesque. He is the author of Iconic Vision, John Parkinson, Los Angeles Architect. Is that that's the title of your book? Pretty much. Okay, so he's here. Pepper, where are you? Pepper, stand up. Pepper is going to be speaking at our salon next month in November. Pepper is Lili Hunt's granddaughter, and Lili Hunt was the manager of Follies, where Betty Rowland started, became famous. So Pepper, you're going to talk about growing up at the Follies, and I'm very excited. You're also going to be speaking, the other speaker is going to be our good friend Christina Rice. She has a biography of Anne Dvorak out. Anne Dvorak was a very interesting, silent, early talkings film actress. Are you coming to that, Martin? Yes, I think he is.
Richard, what's going on over here?
Oh, Leslie.
I forgot, know,
Leslie, totally right. You have a display case. Tchotchkes. Okay, everyone go over and look. Everyone.
Here's a little bit that's portable.
So Leslie's going to show us her display case.
You know, like here's.
So everyone, thank you. If you're here for the walking tour, I'll pass out sign-up sheets in about 15 minutes, and we'll get started. And thank you for coming.
Was literally so hot in the tiara.
Yeah.
She literally had me
In her, basically a museum.
Right.
Dixie's home was in fact a museum. Her life and the lives of the others. And sadly, of course, she's.
That was wonderful, and I'm so.